It's Wednesday, January 15th, 2025. Welcome to this week's Make It Make Sense midweek episode. I'm Granthermes. Happy New Year, and it is good to be back. Today, we are splitting this midweek episode into two parts. First, we're going to talk about the release of the final report from the Justice Department about the case against Donald Trump's plot to steal the 2020 election and the insurrection that he caused on January 6th. And then it is a big week in the Senate with a lot of high-profile confirmation hearings happening, but we're going to dive into the first big hearing. That was for Secretary of Defense nominee Pete Hegseth. But before we get going here, just a little bit of housekeeping. I know that I took a little longer than I had said to get back to doing these episodes, to come back into your feeds. I'm sorry about that, but if you're watching this thing, you can see that we've got our new setup here, and that's because in the time that I was away, my wife and I decided to move across the country back to the city of Detroit, which we love very much. But that meant that I had to take a little more time away to get everything set up. And if you're just a listener, then pretend I'm in whatever room you normally pretend I'm in when I'm talking to you. I also want to say here that there is a lot more Make It Make Sense on the way for you in 2025. I'll be doing daily articles on the Make It Make Sense Substack. I'll be dropping some more MIMS minis as we go along here because with the incoming Trump administration and the soon-to-be Trump administration in full effect, there's going to be a lot of stuff that we're going to need to make some more sense of, and those things will have to happen right away. Also, I'll be doing some more original reporting and more interviews this year that'll be in both your regular feeds and in those feeds for subscribers. So if you haven't subscribed to the Make It Make Sense Substack yet, please do that. It's just $5 a month. That lowest tier, you can get access to everything. You can comment, you can chat with me. It's all right there. And the link on how to do that is in the description for this show. But enough of that for now. Let's get into the DOJ's report. So this report came from the now former special counsel Jack Smith, who stepped down last week. And if you're just joining this whole thing, no worries there. Smith was appointed by Attorney General Merrick Garland to investigate Trump for both the attack on the Capitol on January 6, 2021, and for hoarding thousands of documents, classified and not, at Mar-a-Lago. Those are two separate cases. Now, we don't have the documents report yet, but we do have the January 6th report. It is an exhaustive 174-page report that goes through all of the nitty-gritty of the things that, frankly, we already know because we had a lot of great reporting about it at the time as it was happening and then after it happened because we got audio recordings of Trump trying to undermine the election results, and we saw a lot of it with our own eyes in real time, definitely including January 6th. Leading up to it especially, and in the hours-long congressional hearings by the January 6th committee. Now, despite all the writing in this report, which it's a lot, but it is worth reading if you got some downtime, especially because we are 5 days away from Donald Trump taking the oath of office again, there are just 5 sentences, I think, in this report that are the most important. The first 3 I want to talk about are that Trump knew that he had lost the election, and all of the posturing and blustering and grandstanding about election fraud and the election being stolen was all a lie. The special prosecutor here wrote this about Trump knowing. The office investigated whether Mr. Trump believed the claims he made. Evidence from a variety of sources established that Mr. Trump knew that there was no outcome-determinative fraud in the 2020 election, that many of the specific claims he made were untrue, and that he had lost the election. He knew this because some of the highest-ranking officials in his own administration, including the vice president, told him directly that there was no evidence to support his claims. And I know that's a lot there, but what Smith is saying here is that despite all the claims of voter fraud, of voting machines being hacked by the ghost of Hugo Chavez or someone in Venezuela or China, or poll workers acting illegally, Jack Smith found that Trump was told by trusted advisors, high-ranking people, and close confidants that there was no evidence to support his lies and that there was no version of a world that he could have reasonably thought that he was telling the truth. That reasonable thinking has been part of Trump's defense for quite a while. It's sort of melted into his legal team's ultimately winning presidential immunity argument that he was acting as president and therefore has immunity from being convicted of any crimes while he's acting as president. That's an argument that the Supreme Court also agreed with last year, but baked into that is the notion that he needed to believe and know that he was acting truthfully as the president in the interest of the country and not himself, meaning, again, he needed to reasonably believe that the 2020 election had been rigged. And Smith here is saying in this report and in his investigation that he found and proved that Trump didn't believe it, meaning he wasn't acting as a president. He was acting as just an individual dude trying to hold on to power for himself. That's also something the January 6th Congressional Committee found as well. And frankly, it's not an unsurprising finding given how we know Trump operates in public and in private life. He does things only if there's some sort of upside to him personally. But if that was unsurprising, the absolutely most important parts of this report came at the very end. Jack Smith saying that if Trump hadn't been elected president, he would have been convicted in the January 6th case. Here's what he said, and this is, again, another one of those things that's pretty legally, so bear with me. But Jack Smith, writing in this report, the department's view that the Constitution prohibits the continued indictment and prosecution of a president is categorical. It does not turn on the gravity of the crimes charged, the strength of the government's proof, or the merits of the prosecution, which the office stands fully behind. He means his office. Indeed, but for Mr. Trump's election and imminent return to the presidency, the office assessed that the admissible evidence was sufficient to obtain and sustain a conviction at trial. So what he's really saying here is that the Department of Justice has a long-standing understanding of the Constitution that a sitting president should and cannot be indicted while they're president. It's not a law, it's an internal DOJ rule, which they're really strict about, because you want the Department of Justice to be an impartial and independent department and not one that's undermining the choices of voters. Has that always been the case? No. See former FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. But it's an important pillar of the DOJ as we understand it now. And more importantly, what Smith is saying here is that they have the evidence to convict Trump in a court of law. After months of digging and investigating, he and his team, he says, had Trump dead to rights. It is a stunning piece of American history, both for the reasons that a special prosecutor was able to build this case and make these findings, but also that these findings will be the only piece of accountability for one of America's darkest days. I mean, this is where this case likely ends. Those are the final words in the report, and they're likely going to be the final words on whether Donald Trump will be held accountable for the things that we saw and heard with our own eyes and ears. Is there a world in which this case could get reopened after Trump leaves office in 2028? Sure. Is it likely? Not even a little bit. By that time, the country will have moved on. It'll be 7 years removed from the attack on the Capitol. New things will have happened that will need addressing in courts and maybe investigating. And that's also assuming he does leave in 2028. And I know it's grim, but also if he's still alive after 2028. And I'm not going to get into all the ways that he could push for a third term as president. He would be 82 when that would happen. But he's joked about it before. I'm not going to go into that now. That's a lot of speculation. But I'm also not wishing death on him either. It is just worth pointing out that for the last 15 years, he's lived an extremely stressful life. He's 78 years old and about to do the most stressful job on the planet for the next 4 years. And he's not exactly in the best shape. And just given the actuarial tables on this whole thing, there's a good chance that should someone want to bring this case again, there might not be someone to bring it against. Now, there is another investigative report looming here as well, but it's really, really unclear if it'll ever see the light of day, at least in a legal sense. That's the classified documents case, where Donald Trump is accused of stealing hundreds of classified documents and thousands more non-classified documents from the White House after he left office and storing them in boxes all over his Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida. And again, we've seen this. We have pictures of these documents from the FBI. It's been widely reported. We've seen in writing Trump refusing to return documents the government has said don't belong to him as an individual, but to the government as a whole. But in the course of this, there's been a Florida judge, Eileen Cannon, who at pretty much every step of the way, legal scholars agree nearly across the board that she's shown a pretty blatant disregard for the law and precedent and even jurisdiction in that case. She tried to block the release of the report and get the entire case dismissed. She made the argument that the entire case should be thrown out, and she did throw out the case because Jack Smith was appointed illegally, which isn't a thing. She decided that special counsels are illegal despite the fact that they've been around since 1875. The first one was appointed by President Ulysses S. Grant after the Civil War, and the existence of special counsels and their necessity for the DOJ has been upheld in courts high and low across the country for more than 100 years. Now, Cannon is a judge in the federal court in Florida and tried to reach over outside of her jurisdiction, her federal court, into the D.C. court where the January 6th case was to try to block that report. Now, that got shot down, but it's likely she'll try to block this report in Florida. And her argument that Jack Smith is illegal as a special prosecutor is also what Trump's team is now saying in response to the January 6th report. As for the report in the federal documents case, if Cannon gets her way, we will never know through legal means what Jack Smith found. If that doesn't get released through legal channels, will that report get leaked? 100%. And if you're a listener and you've got that report, MIMS Newspod, MIMS Newspod @gmail.com is where you send it, and my DMs on social media are wide open. But let's leave Jack Smith for now and turn to Pete Hegseth and his long confirmation hearing as Trump's pick to lead the U.S. military as Secretary of Defense. So Hegseth was in the hot seat on Tuesday, which was also incidentally my birthday, so I spent my 33rd birthday watching hours of Senate hearings because this is my life now. Anyway, I've talked about Hegseth a ton. You can go back and listen to a few of the episodes. I think it's not the most recent episode, but the two before that, where I talk a lot about Hegseth, and listen to the interview with Jennifer Kavanaugh from Defense Priorities about what the job of a Secretary of Defense actually is and what it takes to run a department that has a budget of $850 billion and has more than 2 million employees and service members to oversee. So Hegseth was questioned about all the things that I've talked about. His reported history of drinking on the job while he was an executive at several veterans organizations and a host at Fox News, financial mismanagement to a potentially criminal level at those veterans organizations, his reported history of cheating on and abusing his ex-wives, the reported history and pattern of abusing women physically and sexually, something pointed out by his own mother in an email she sent to him and at least implied, although not explicitly said, in a settlement that Hegseth made to a woman who accused him of sexual assault. All of those things, by the way, violate the military uniform code of conduct, although the Secretary of Defense is not a military position, it's a civil one. And when he was asked directly by senators in his confirmation hearing about those reported shortcomings, he never actually answered those questions directly with a yes or a no or a true or a false. He most often just said they were anonymous smears, occasionally implying that they were made up by NBC News specifically. Hegseth also, in his tenure, defended service members who were convicted of war crimes, was reportedly caught yelling, "Kill all Muslims" at a hotel bar, and has said that the biggest threat to the military isn't an external enemy, but diversity within the military, including allowing women to serve in combat, something he wrote in his latest book and stood by as recently as this past November. Now, the hearing was conducted by the Senate Armed Services Committee. All of the confirmation hearings are done by committees that oversee whatever policy area or department the nominee is going to be in charge of, so it's not the same people every time if you tune into these things. But what makes this committee unique is that a lot of the members of this committee are veterans themselves, including several women who served, including Tammy Duckworth, an Iraq vet who lost both of her legs while serving overseas in an attack, Alyssa Slotkin, who served in Iraq while she was part of the CIA, Republican Senator from Iowa, Joni Ernst, who served in the National Guard and was deployed to Kuwait and Iraq. We'll come back to her in just a second. She's important. And Senator Kirsten Gillibrand from New York, who has been a leader in the movement against sexual assault in the military, although she is not a veteran herself. Now, the biggest clashes happened between Hegseth and Democratic women on the committee who had obvious concerns about his views on the roles of women serving in the military. But lo and behold, Hegseth appears to have changed his mind on that subject just in time for his confirmation hearing, saying that he would support women in combat roles now. Here's how Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren felt about that.
But I want to be clear here. For 12 years, you were quite open about your views, and your views were consistently the same. Women are inferior soldiers, sailors, Marines, airmen, and guardians. And in case anyone missed the point, and these are your words from 10 weeks ago, women absolutely straight up should not be permitted to serve in combat. And I notice on each of these quotes, those are said without qualification. It's not by how much you can lift or how fast you can run. They don't belong in combat, period, or your words, straight up. And then on November 9th, 2024, just 32 days after your last public comment saying that women absolutely should not be in combat, you declared that, quote, some of our greatest warriors are women, and you support having them serve in combat. Now, that is a very, very big about face in a very, very short period of time. So help me understand, Mr. Hegseth, what extraordinary event happened in that 32-day period that made you change the core values you had expressed for the preceding 12 years?
Senator, again, I very much appreciate you bringing up my comments from 2013 because for me, this issue has always been about standards. And unfortunately, because of some of the people that have been in political power for the last 4 years, priorities other than standards, lethality, and meritocracy have driven decision-making.
I'm quoting you from the podcast. Women shouldn't be in combat at all. Where is the reference to standards?
And she's not wrong there. It does seem strange that he has changed his mind on something that he was so willing to talk all about publicly just a few months ago, and then when he was nominated, he drops it. But Hegseth, and this is one of the most telling things, I think, and maybe one of the most important lines of questioning that was asked of Hegseth from multiple senators, he was asked about whether he'd ignore illegal or unconstitutional orders from President Trump, like, say, shooting protesters or turning the might of the American military against American citizens. And he wouldn't answer the question when it was asked to him pretty plainly and pretty specifically by brand new Michigan Senator Elissa Slotkin. And I'm going to play this whole clip. It's about 2.5 minutes long. I know that's long, but it's important to hear the whole thing.
As the Secretary of Defense, you will be the one man standing in the breach should President Trump give an illegal order, right? I'm not saying he will, but if he does, you are going to be the guy that he calls to implement this order. Do you agree that there are some orders that can be given by the Commander-in-Chief that would violate the U.S. Constitution?
Senator, thank you for your service. But I reject the premise that President Trump is going to be giving illegal orders.
No, I'm not saying he will, but do you believe there is such a thing as an illegal order that Joe Biden or any other president, Donald Trump, could give? Is there anything that a commander-in-chief could ask you to do with the uniformed military that would be in violation of the U.S. Constitution?
Senator, anybody of any party could give an order that is against the Constitution or against the law.
Right. Okay. Are you saying that you would stand in the breach and push back if you were given an illegal order?
I start by saying I reject the premise that President Trump will be giving
you've done your
any illegal
to him,
orders
but
at all.
This isn't a hypothetical, okay? Your predecessor in a Trump administration, Secretary Esper, was asked and did use uniformed military to clear unarmed protesters. He was given the order to potentially shoot at them. Helos flew low in Washington, D.C. as crowd control. He later apologized publicly for those actions. was he right or wrong to apologize?
Senator, I was there on the ground.
And
I saw the
I understand,
helo
and I
myself.
respect that.
I've been there.
But you're
I
about
understand
to
the
be
level
the
of threat
Secretary of Defense.
that was involved in that moment. I
Was
also
he right
understand
to? So he was
legality and the Constitution.
Sir, was he right
and the laws
or
of what
wrong
you have.
to apologize?
I'm not going to put words in the mouth of Secretary Esper or anybody else.
he said them himself. You don't have to. What are you scared of? Did he do the right thing by apologizing?
I'm not scared of anything, Senator.
Then say
I'm
yes or no.
interested
You
in
can say
upholding
no.
the laws and the Constitution
Okay.
in any
So
particular
Donald
scenario.
Trump asked for the active duty 82nd Airborne to be deployed during that same time. Secretary Esper has written that he convinced him against that decision. If Donald Trump asked you to use the 82nd Airborne in law enforcement roles in Washington, D.C., would you also convince him otherwise?
I'm not going to get ahead of conversations I would have with the president. However, there are laws and processes inside our Constitution that would be foul.
So that's not an answer, right? It seems like saying I would push back against any order that I knew to be illegal would be an easy thing to say. And he didn't say it. And that's pretty out of the norm for how we understand how secretaries of any department do their jobs. They're not required to follow illegal or unconstitutional orders. In fact, it's their job to advise presidents not to give those orders. Now, Hegseth, and he starts to say it a couple times in this exchange with Slotkin, and he said it multiple times during the hearing. He was a member of the National Guard during the George Floyd protests in D.C. He was a low-ish ranking officer. He was a major, which is like the fourth highest rank for officers out of 10, so he was 4 out of 10. Now, he was there when Trump called in the National Guard and used troops to clear Lafayette Square of protesters so that Trump could walk across the street and hold the Bible upside down for a photo op in front of a church. And Hegseth has continued to defend the use of troops in that instance, despite a lot of very respected former generals and military leaders and experts saying it was unnecessary and it was, frankly, damaging to the military and the image of the military. But Hegseth clearly doesn't share those views. There were more of those kinds of exchanges, but really the one person everyone was watching on the committee was Senator Joni Ernst from Iowa. I said we come back to her. She was among the Republicans who initially said she couldn't support Hegseth for the allegations against him, for his abuse of women physically and sexually, like I said before, but also his views on women serving in combat roles. And she was considered somebody that he needed to get her vote so that he could be confirmed. Now, she grilled him on his views on women in combat, his history of alleged drinking and that alleged abuse. And after the hearing, she seemed satisfied with what she heard. And she ultimately said she would support him for the job, essentially paving the way for him to be our next Secretary of Defense. And to be honest, that's what most people expected to happen. And in the end, I found and am finding, because there are currently 2 confirmation hearings happening right now as I'm recording this, that these confirmation hearings are kind of boring when it comes to the questions being asked and the answers being given. The much more interesting thing here is seeing how senators who just a few years ago would never have considered someone with Hegseth's past or the allegations against him for this role specifically, they're now openly defending him or throwing their hands up and going along to get along with an incoming second Trump administration. Yes, these hearings are as much for the public to get a feel for who is going to help run our country for as long as they're in these roles. Usually it's, maybe 2 years or a year at best, but it's as much for us as it is for the senators who are also constitutionally mandated to do their job of advising and consenting to the people that presidents appoint and nominate to these roles. That's why we have these hearings, but it also means that there's supposed to be sort of a check on the president a little bit. And I talked about signs that Republicans in the Senate might become the quote-unquote adults in the room when it was Matt Gaetz up for Attorney General in the next Trump administration. Basically them saying that by not confirming Gaetz and saying that Gaetz doesn't have the votes, that Trump isn't going to get everything he wants. But it turns out that that was less about not giving Trump what he wanted so that they could hold on to some sort of check and balance power, and just way more that no one on Capitol Hill liked Matt Gaetz, and they didn't want him around in their daily lives. So the point being here, as you watch clips or read about these hearings, take note of just how much verbal gymnastics Republicans in particular, because they're going to be the party in power, seem to be doing to show Trump they're on his side. How much they're willing to give up power, how much they're willing to erode that power, and how much of what we understand as normal Senate duties they're willing to shirk to give Trump everything he wants. Because if this is how they treat the most important and most difficult hearings these senators will do, think about what'll happen on the things that they don't care about. Okay, that is it for today's episode. Please rate and review the show on whatever podcast app you're listening to it on. It really helps boost the show in the algorithm and helps put it on people's feeds who aren't listeners yet. Like and subscribe and hit that bell for notifications on YouTube so you don't miss out on any new videos, and it helps spread the word on YouTube as well. Also, like I said before, subscribe to the Make It Make Sense Substack, where I've got articles coming, bonus content every week, and just a lot of good stuff there if you want to help make a little bit more sense out of the stuff we're talking about. And as always, share this show on social media. It's Mims News Pod. That's MIMS News Pod, all one word on every platform. I am at Grant Herms on X and Bluesky, and at Grant Herms TV on everything else. Thank you so much for listening today. I'm Grant Herms, and I'll talk to you on Friday.